Hey everyone, me Kevin here. In this video, I'm going to talk about racism. Racism is not an easy topic to talk about and can be very upsetting. If you're not comfortable watching this, I understand, but I do still encourage you to watch and continue because I believe it is our duty as Americans to spend more time talking about racism rather than less. We should have more people of all colors talking about racism, not less. So in this video, I'm going to talk about some very difficult topics, but I'm going to try to make them as simple as possible to understand racism as best as possible. And by doing so, I believe we can find a potential solution. And only by understanding as much about racism as we can we ever help to solve it. So this is my attempt to understand racism. I'm going to start with a study and some facts, and then we'll get into more facts and conclusions. Fact number one. Americans believe that poor people work less hard than non-poor people. And the fact is, on a ratio basis, blacks are more likely than whites to be poor. Well, Christopher DeSante conducted a study, which I will link all of my research down below, that analyzed 1,000 study participants' reactions to requests from individuals to receive government aid. Basically, each person in the study was told, here are two pieces of paper. Each of them represents a person who needs government aid. Your job is to look at those pieces of paper and determine which of those people is worth or worthy of more government aid based on how hard they work. So basically, they did a study and said, here, you know what? All right, your name's Jim. Here you go, Jim. Here are two pieces of paper, two applications for government aid. You've got $1,500 to spend on them. You could either give them both $750. You could give one person more, one person less, but you only got $1,500. Both of them need $900. You figure it out. Here's the application. And the applications would say the people's first name, and then would have everything else redacted other than the person's first name, their work, and how many children they had, which all of the things like work and how many children they had, all those things were sort of tested in the study to make sure that those things didn't have a consistent impact in how people responded. Well, here's what the study ended up finding. The study found that the only real difference was the fact that some of those applications had the name Emily and Lori, and some of the applications had the names Kesha and Latoya. Lori and Emily sound white. Kesha and Latoya sound black. The study revealed that when both Kesha and Emily were deemed to be lazy workers based on the hours they work, Emily's benefits went down by $25 per month. So if Emily was supposed to get, say, $900, she got maybe $875. Well, Kesha's benefits were reduced by over $100. That's 4 times the reduction that Emily had, and the only noticeable difference in the study were the people's names, which were purposefully set up as Emily, Lori, Kesha, and Latoya. Well, when study participants determined that both applicants were hard workers based on their hours worked or whatever, when the study participants said, okay, both of these people work hard, they ended up giving Emily more money than they gave Kesha on average. In fact, on average, if they gave Kesha $10 more because she was a hard worker, so she got $10 more than the base, Emily would get $100 more than Kesha. So the fact is, in a country where we say hard work is rewarded, blacks can often work harder, yet earn less. And so the fact is, blacks in America were affected by slavery and segregation. We know that whites were not. Fact, we know that after the Civil Rights Act in 1965, blacks were still discriminated against. We also know that the typical white family has 10 times the wealth of a typical black family. And just a heads up, the reason the Brookings Institute uses typical and not average is because average would include very rich and very poor, and they really tried to look at the middle of America. That's why they say typical. So the typical white has 10 times the wealth of a typical black. That's not income, wealth, cars, real estate, stocks, money in the bank, That's wealth. Which, full disclaimer, I am sponsored in this video by Webull, where if you deposit $100, you get 2 free stocks worth up to $1,400. Or if you sign up for life insurance, those are sponsored items. They have nothing to do with the content of this video. You can check those out. You're welcome to, but they have nothing to do with the content of this video. I just want to make that very clear and separate those things. I also have programs on how to learn finance if you have no idea how to manage money, or you want to get into stocks or whatever. Check out those programs down below, real estate investing, but those are separate from these stats. Let's continue on. Fact, 20% of blacks are in poverty, and 17.6% of Hispanics are in poverty. 11% of Asians are in poverty, and 8.5% of whites are in poverty. But the fact is also that whites commit more crimes in America than blacks because there are more whites in America than blacks. That's why whites are considered the majority, and Asians, Hispanics, and blacks are considered minorities. However, a further fact is if a black person walks up to you, they are 2.5 times as likely to be in poverty than a white person. And even if they are not in poverty, they're likely to be 10 times less wealthy than a white person. We already said that. Well, another fact, according to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, is that poverty is associated with higher crime. In fact, people in poverty are twice as likely to be victims of violent crime compared to people with middle incomes and above. And people in poverty are more likely to be affected by violent crimes involving guns. See, visual cues now can also lead to associations with money. And what I mean with that is if somebody's wearing a hoodie, well, then we might assume that they're more likely to be in poverty than somebody wearing a suit. So if visual cues can help us assess who's in poverty or not, and we know the fact that blacks are 2.5 times more likely to be in poverty, then by random chance, if a black person walks up to us, we can pick up on a visual cue that says this person is black. They are 2.5 times more likely to be in poverty than if a white person walked up to me, or if a Hispanic person walks up, that makes them twice as likely to be in poverty than if a white person walked up to me. And the fact is that people in poverty are twice as likely to be exposed to violent crime, including crime that involves guns. There's a greater likelihood that you're exposed to crime involving guns in poverty. Then the fact is, humans take or make visual deductions that have to do with their perception of the safety of people in poverty. In other words, and I'm not trying to make a chicken or the egg conclusion here in terms of what came first, the chicken or the egg, but the bottom line is, racism can be a cause of poverty, and poverty can be a cause of racism. Both are issues. When people believe somebody is in poverty, they potentially believe that they are more dangerous, and therefore racism happens. When people are discriminated against, a normal Irish person that comes to America versus a normal black person that comes to America, both of them could be completely equal. Same education, same criminal background, no criminal background. Everything's the same about the two. Simply because of visual cues. And the study that we started out with, we find that the Irish person is more likely to succeed in the American system than the black person because of discrimination and racism. And I think no matter what color we are, when we put these statistics together, we have to recognize that that's exactly what's happening. And when we recognize where, again, not trying to do chicken or the egg here, okay? People can become racist because of these statistics, and then they could forget the statistics and they could stay racist, and they could pass on racism through generations. This could have all happened hundreds of years ago. Who knows when it started, right? Not trying to analyze when racism started. All we know is that it exists. And the statistics don't help. So really, the statistics are doing this. But the problem is that this statistical racism has become human racism. And this has started that chain reaction that gets worse every single generation. And then we go on to another fact. And that's the fact that cops are promoted based on statistics, arrests, felonies, misdemeanors. A cop is more likely to want to be promoted because, well, people want to get promoted, make more money, and retire earlier. Which means a cop would be incentivized to find crime faster and more efficiently. Well, if a cop is choiced with, do I go to a white neighborhood which has a lower chance of poverty, or do I go to a black neighborhood with a higher chance of poverty? Generally, a cop is going to go to an area with more poverty, which disproportionately tends to be a black neighborhood. And a lot of this can happen completely subconsciously, like in the study at the beginning. But we have another fact, and the fact is that cops are promoted based on statistics, like arrests, felonies, and misdemeanors. And this is a problem in our country, because the fact is, if you get promoted based on statistics as a cop, you're going to want to be as efficient as possible in fighting as much crime as possible, which means that cops are, whether they realize it or not, more motivated to go to poor areas to find more crime. And unfortunately, blacks are more likely to be in poverty than whites. They're 2.5 times as likely as whites to be in poverty. And this might mean that police might be more likely to patrol a black neighborhood because the odds of finding crime might be higher. In fact, the Wall Street Journal found that because minority communities have more crime, officers suffer from, quote, threat perception, which is the belief that someone in a poor area is more likely to have a firearm. Now, here's my opinion. Cops are trained more on self-defense and aggression and restraining people and marksmanship than they are on de-escalation. I believe that to be true. And that's a problem, especially when we put all these pieces of the puzzle together. But a further fact is that the court systems also favor cops over victims. Supreme Court Justice Sotomayor said so herself. Now, clarity, that does not mean courts favor whites. It means courts favor cops over victims. And all of this builds on something known as the racial vortex. Blacks are poor, leading them to be in poverty more often, meaning people that are black are more likely at random to be in poverty, possibly starting, and if not starting, then reiterating the cycle of racism. And unfortunately, thanks to structural racism by police forces and courts, blacks are disproportionately targeted via this other form of racism. As blacks are targeted more often, the media covers these crimes more often, perpetuating racism by individuals. And every single recession that happens, the poor become poorer, which means schools become worse, hospitals become worse, education becomes worse, graduation rates go down. And the bottom line is, a randomly chosen black who has a higher chance of being in poverty has a higher chance of being affected or a victim of violent crime involving a firearm, and has lower chances of graduating, lower chances of getting ahead in life, lower chances of getting out of the paycheck to paycheck loop. Everything relates back to racism. Now, this is not to say that there are not poor white people. There are twice as many poor white people in America as they are poor black people. The issue, the difference, is the visual cue that when a random person walks up, we can instantly say or identify that person is more likely to be in poverty, therefore more likely to be associated with crime. This is why racial profiling by police forces was banned. Unfortunately, racial profiling was banned, but profiling vehicles was not banned. So now cops can target cars that look black, which give them more of an opportunity to pull people over who are black. This is how you get widespread racism, where both rich, middle income, and poor blacks are discriminated against more than equally poor middle American or rich white people, or even Asians, or even immigrants that come to this country. You might not know this, but I am an immigrant to this country. I came to this country from Germany. An entire German family. But you wouldn't know that by looking at me. When you look at me, I don't send you visual cues of poverty. Statistically, looking at me does not create the sense of, oh, higher chance of poverty. In fact, when you look at me, everything says the opposite. White says less chance of poverty. Suit, presumably less chance of poverty. And then the stupid stuff in the background and stuff, probably less chance of poverty. There are a lot of assumptions that we can make. But the fact is, when we look at racism, we can look at programs like affirmative action, which are attempts to solve racism. Affirmative action allows blacks to get into schools with lower grades and lower fees than whites. Yet guess what this often causes? This often causes more racism through something known as racial resentment, which is when other races are frustrated over the system designed to level the playing field for blacks. Which means, in simple words, white people look at affirmative action and go, man, that's bullcrap, they're getting handouts. When in reality, affirmative action is just trying to level the playing field. But it does so in a way that actually creates racial resentment. People don't like to see other people getting handouts because America is based on this impression of fairness. But unfortunately, it's anything but fair. Remember the study at the beginning of this video. It shows that we don't tend to act fairly, even though we all want fairness. And the fact is that poverty leads to worse education, worse healthcare, worse job opportunities, and worse chances of getting ahead. And we also know that people in poverty are more likely to grow up in a single-parent household. The Brookings Institute found that actually 70% of blacks are born without fathers. There are two potential reasons for this. Blacks have less money and wealth to begin with, which means they have less money for doctors, fertility, family planning, or contraceptives. And blacks are more likely to be on welfare because they're more likely to be in poverty. And ironically, if you're on welfare, you're less likely to have fathers willing to have what are called, quote, shotgun weddings, which is when somebody marries somebody else because they got pregnant with them, because, well, welfare is going to take care of that family and the child. They maybe don't need a father, which I know that sounds like an extreme conclusion. I have to say I have my reservations with what the Brookings Institute concluded in that. I will link it down below. But it is thought-provoking. I think it's a little bit of a blurry conclusion. I don't think we know exactly why blacks have a tendency to be born 70% of the time into a fatherless household. But these two things kind of, again, relate back to money. So why then is it that a German or Irish can come to America? Well, this is why people use a phrase known as white privilege. White privilege is something that no white person ever wants to even say, because it almost discredits what you have become if you've created a job or wealth or you've created a business or something in your life. But when we look at that study at the beginning, we go, well, the fact is, as white people, we might not be affected by that study negatively. In fact, we would be on the benefiting end of that study. And that's a problem. It should be equal. I think we could all agree it should be equal. There shouldn't be a privilege for any certain group. But solely going back to the visual cues of black person walks up to you, white person walks up to you. Which way are you walking towards? And why do people make certain conclusions? Well, A, because now just there's racism everywhere. But maybe originally it was because, well, blacks are more likely to be in poverty, which means they're more likely to be associated with violent crime and firearms than whites. And it's not because they're black. It's not like a black person comes to America and says, I'm black, I'm going to get a gun and go into poverty. You think anybody wants to be in poverty? Of course not. And the bottom line is, the Bureau of Justice Statistics found that the crime rates between whites in poverty and blacks in poverty is virtually equal. In fact, I actually looked at the numbers specifically, and whites in poverty are actually slightly more likely to be involved in violent crime than blacks in poverty. Barely. They're almost equal. The point is to say it's not race that causes crime, it's poverty that causes crime. But unfortunately, racism could lead people into poverty or make it more difficult for people to get out of poverty. This is why the racism debate is so incredibly complicated. But for an immigrant to come to this country with nothing versus a black to come to this country with nothing, a black immigrant versus, let's say, a white immigrant, the color of a white person's skin will help them succeed because they won't have that discounting factor that blacks have to deal with, the association with poverty rates and crime. This is what I call the vortex of racism. And this brings up the question, can money fix racism? Many have suggested that reparations should be paid to blacks for what they've had to go through. But the issue with reparations is that reparations actually perpetuate racial resentment. When people in America think somebody is getting something for free, they get upset, which creates more racial resentment and more problems. Now, this leads to the most beautiful opportunity our country has today. $2,000 per month stimulus checks would immediately lift everyone out of poverty. In fact, $500 per month would immediately lift everybody out of poverty. But it's something like what the lockdown did for climate change, this pandemic could do for poverty. Because imagine this, if you have less poverty, you have less crime, which means you have a lower need for policing, which gives police the time to get their act together and maybe fix the court systems, fix qualified immunity, fix police brutality, and fix de-escalation training, while at the same time, more money should be allocated to hospitals and schools. So we're fixing poverty, we're fixing schools, we're fixing hospitals, we're fixing education, we're fixing police, and we're fixing courts all at the same time. Fixing the incentives for cops, everything. But the bottom line is, when we're asked, can money solve racism? No, money cannot make racism go away, but money can address the massive issues that lead to more racism in this country. Money can address poverty. Money can address hospitals. Money can address housing. Money can address schools. Money can address education. Money can address police force training. Money can address courts. Money can solve all of these things. The list goes on in terms of the things that need to be fixed, don't get me wrong. But this pandemic provides the perfect opportunity. See, while reparations for blacks would cause probably more racial tensions, you have this unique opportunity now where stimulus checks for everyone do not cause racial tensions. So again, no, $2,000 per month cannot solve racism in itself, but it can solve major issues that lead to racism, especially money for hospitals and schools and so on. The vortex of poverty must end. Bad social systems and structural racism must end. Bad courts must end. Bad cops must end. And other problems that reiterate racism through the vortex of racism must come to an end. Thank you so much for watching this. I hope you appreciated this. Consider subscribing. And folks, we'll see you next time.